Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. So that YouTube continues to show you stories like this one, make sure you do. This photo was never supposed to exist. Tucked deep inside a crumbling family Bible, its edges were yellowed and brittle. For nearly a century, it had remained hidden. Staring back at you from it is a pale-faced child. Her eyes set just a fraction too far apart, her jawline strangely unfinished, her mouth caught somewhere between a grimace and a plea. The photographer's mark is smudged, yet you can just make out the faint embossing of a long-forgotten studio in Appalachia. Someone long dead had tried to bury this evidence. But silence is something paper has a way of outlasting. Her name was Ruth Elkins, or at least that's what the last surviving records suggest. To the town of Burn Hollow, West Virginia, she represented the final branch of a tree that should never have been allowed to grow. Older than the county itself was her bloodline, tangled with secrets that were whispered behind church doors and traded like curses between neighbors. For generations, the Elkins name had been synonymous with power and with shame. Their wealth was built on land stolen twice over, first from the Cherokee and then from the coal miners who bled for every cent. But wealth wasn't enough to keep them from themselves. For decades, cousins married cousins not for love, but to protect deeds, minds, and crooked promises. Every marriage contract was a lock on a treasure chest no outsider was ever meant to open. And in every surviving photograph from the family archives, the few that escaped the flames, you can see it happening slowly, generation after generation. Shoulders narrowing, eyes drifting off-center, hands becoming oddly delicate, as if the very blood was recoiling. Ruth was born in the winter of 1924, a winter when the snow sealed Burn Hollow off from the outside world for 3 straight months. The midwife, a woman who had seen more than her share of hard births, would later tell her daughter that when she first held the baby, it felt like she was holding a confession. In public, no one spoke of the Elkins bloodline again. But the photograph remained, a silent witness waiting for someone reckless enough to look closer. The whispers about Burn Hollow never traveled far, but in small towns, whispers don't need distance to survive. By the 1930s, the coal seams were drying up, and the Elkins' fortune had started to rot from the inside out. What remained of their wealth was guarded like a dragon's hoard, and anyone who questioned the family's past found themselves frozen out of the town's already meager opportunities. The church elders would nod politely, the sheriff would shrug, and the conversation would always dissolve into talk of weather and hunting seasons. But behind closed doors, in kitchens lit by kerosene lamps, people spoke of strange cries echoing from the Elkins homestead on cold nights. Some said it was just the wind through broken windows. Others said it was the sound of old sins refusing to stay buried. Under the weight of that silence, Ruth grew up. Neighbors remembered her as painfully shy, a girl who lingered at the edges of Sunday school but never joined in the hymns. The few surviving school records describe her handwriting as delicate but erratic. Letters were sometimes reversed, numbers transposed. Teachers whispered about her peculiar gaze, an unsettling look, as if she was watching something behind you, something you couldn't turn to see. By the age of 13, Ruth had already outlived 2 uncles, both of whom had died under circumstances too suspicious to be accidents, yet too shameful to be investigated. There was one story, told in half-breaths by a retired coal miner, about a traveling census worker who once knocked on the Elkins' door. He had been looking for a missing page in the county ledger. The family invited him inside for supper, but he returned to town pale and shaking, muttering that he'd seen faces on the walls, portraits, dozens of them, every single one with the same off-kilter stare. He never went back. A week later, the Elkins hired men to board up the old parlor, and nobody asked why. The deeper you dig into Burn Hollow's archives, the more paper seems to have disappeared. You find marriage licenses with mismatched dates, birth records with names scratched out, property transfers signed by hands that couldn't write a straight line. It's as though someone tried to rewrite the past but left too many fingerprints behind. Even now, a century later, those fingerprints lead back to Ruth, the last child born, bearing the family's forbidden blood. And if you follow them, you start to see a pattern that feels older than the hills themselves. By the winter of 1938, Ruth was 14 and already carried herself like an old woman. Burn Hollow was shrinking. Families were moving north for factory work, leaving their homes to sag under creeping vines. The Elkins homestead, once a proud white farmhouse on a ridge, now looked skeletal against the gray sky, its paint peeled away to raw wood. Locals swore you could feel the temperature drop when you walked past its gate. Children dared each other to run up and touch the front door, but few ever crossed the fence line twice. A story is preserved in the journal of a traveling preacher who passed through Burn Hollow that year. He wrote of being invited to supper by Ruth's father, a gaunt man with hands blackened from years in the mines. The preacher described the meal as silent, the only sound the creak of chairs on warped floorboards. But what chilled him wasn't the quiet. It was the way every Elkins at the table avoided looking at Ruth. When she spoke, her voice trembled like distant thunder. She asked the preacher if sins could outlive the sinners. He said her father's fork froze in midair. Ruth's schooling ended abruptly that spring. Officially, she was needed at home, but the truth whispered through Burn Hollow was darker. A teacher had found a crude drawing on her desk, a tree with roots twisting like snakes around buried faces. On the trunk, in a child's shaky hand, was scrolled, "We are the roots." When the teacher asked who had drawn it, Ruth stared through her and said, "It's always been there." The next day, her name was struck from the roll. The Elkins began sealing themselves off completely. Windows were boarded, curtains drawn even in daylight. Yet, on certain moonless nights, a lantern could be seen moving from room to room, as if someone inside was searching for something they'd lost long ago. A hunter passing by claimed he heard voices, low and rhythmic, like chanting. But when he paused to listen, the air went dead silent. By then, even the most stubborn neighbors avoided the ridge after dark. Ruth's presence became more ghost than girl. There were sightings of her at the edge of the woods, her pale figure slipping between trees, and always that strange, heavy feeling, as if the land itself was remembering. By the early 1940s, the Elkins name had nearly vanished from local conversation, replaced by a kind of uneasy amnesia. Burn Hollow's men had been drafted or left for the war effort, and the women carried on, tending gardens among abandoned houses. The ridge where Ruth lived seemed frozen in another century, untouched by ration books, blackouts, or news from battlefields overseas. Those few who dared wander near claimed the homestead's chimney smoked even when the fireplace was cold, as if the house itself was exhaling the memories no one else would keep. One evening in 1942, an itinerant photographer, his car broken down on the mountain road, claimed he saw Ruth standing by the fence, a lantern cradled in her hands. He described her face as both young and impossibly old, her features distorted in the lantern's sway. He asked if she needed help, but she only whispered, "You shouldn't be here," before disappearing into the trees. The photographer later developed the single frame he'd managed to take, only to find it fogged and warped, the figure barely a smudge of light against the darkness. He kept the ruined photo anyway, tucked behind his wallet like a talisman. Around this time, county clerks began to notice strange discrepancies. A birth certificate for a child named Ruth Elkins was quietly altered. The date shifted backward by 2 years. A property deed showed the homestead changing hands within the same family 3 times in a single winter, signatures growing less legible each time. An old tax ledger listed a payment made in coal dust instead of dollars, signed simply with an X beside the Elkins name. Each irregularity was small, forgettable on its own. Together, they formed a map of desperation. Ruth herself seemed to drift out of human time. There are rumors, no official records, that she started walking the woods at night, leaving odd bundles of twigs at the doors of empty houses. A former sheriff recalled seeing her one dawn, barefoot in the frost, staring down at the valley as if she were counting graves. When he called out, she didn't answer. She simply raised a finger to her lips, then faded back into the treeline. Burn Hollow would later call those years the quiet winter, a season when everyone knew something was unraveling on the ridge, but no one dared climb it to find out. By 1944, Burn Hollow was little more than a memory on a fading map. The coal company had abandoned its shafts, and the few families left clung to their gardens and their ghosts. On the ridge, the Elkins farmhouse seemed to sag lower with every season, its windows black and watchful. Children who had never seen Ruth in daylight still whispered her name at night as if she were both a curse and a warning. That spring, a county health inspector was sent to survey abandoned properties for safety hazards. His report survives, barely legible, the ink smeared as if by a shaking hand. He wrote of stepping into the Elkins house to find the walls lined with cracked portraits, men and women all bearing the same unsettling gaze, their faces narrowing generation by generation. In the parlor, he found a cradle draped with yellowed lace. Inside was a single scrap of paper with a date, March 3, 1944, and the words, "The line ends here." Ruth would have been 20 by then. There are no birth records for any child she bore, but local lore insists there was one, a final infant seen by only two people, the midwife who delivered it and the undertaker who buried it. Both women took what they saw to their graves, but secondhand whispers claimed the child was different. Some say its limbs were twisted, others that its eyes were a pale, impossible color. Whatever the truth, the undertaker dug a shallow grave in the frozen ground behind the Elkins house and left no marker. By the following winter, the ridge was abandoned. Years later, hikers found shards of porcelain dolls scattered near the ruins of the farmhouse. Some pieces were worn smooth by rain, but others still bore painted eyes, wide, unblinking, and strangely distant. A local historian salvaged the family Bible from the wreckage. Inside, folded among brittle pages, was that same photograph of Ruth as a child, her unsettling stare reaching across time. The historian kept it, but after 3 sleepless nights, he swore he heard footsteps outside his window, soft, deliberate, stopping just before dawn. The Elkins name faded from county records. Burn Hollow became another ghost town, swallowed by forest. But the photograph passed quietly between collectors. It still surfaces now and then, like a reminder that sins, no matter how deeply buried, do not decay. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. Decades later, in the 1970s, the state authorized a new logging road through the hills above what had once been Burn Hollow. Bulldozers uncovered the faint outlines of forgotten fence posts, and for a few brief weeks, the name Elkins began to circulate again, quietly, like a bad smell carried on the wind. Surveyors claimed their compasses spun uselessly near the ridge. Machinery broke down for no clear reason. One foreman, a hardened man who had worked strip mines across Appalachia, resigned after a single night on site, saying only, "The hills were whispering." Local archives show a peculiar uptick in inquiries around that time. Genealogy enthusiasts, amateur historians, even a pair of university researchers looking for evidence of long-term isolated communities. None stayed long. One researcher, in a letter to a colleague, wrote, "The records are fragmented, but something is here, like a shadow cast by generations of secrecy." 2 weeks later, he abandoned the project entirely without explanation. Those who grew up near Burn Hollow began retelling the old stories. A retired mail carrier confessed that in the early 50s, he once delivered a letter addressed to Ruth E. at an unlisted box. When he handed it over to a pale young woman by the ruined farmhouse, she thanked him in a voice that didn't match her face, older, almost weary. He later realized Ruth would have been long dead by then. By the 1990s, the forest had reclaimed almost everything. The farmhouse had collapsed into itself, leaving only a sagging chimney and the stone threshold where countless Elkins feet had passed. Yet hikers and hunters still reported a strange unease on the ridge. Camera batteries draining unexpectedly, sudden drops in temperature, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. A folklorist collected these accounts and noted a chilling pattern. Several claimed they glimpsed a lone woman standing among the birches, her eyes wide, her head slightly tilted, always just out of focus. Some say Ruth's bloodline didn't end at all, that somewhere, hidden in plain sight, descendants walk among us, carrying the same quiet, unblinking gaze. Others insist the ridge itself absorbed the family's final sin, holding it like a wound that refuses to heal. Either way, the Elkins name has become a warning whispered to children and a ghost story traded around campfires. It is proof that what we bury is never truly gone. Even now, a century after Ruth's birth, the story of the Elkins bloodline clings to the ridges like morning fog. Genealogists occasionally stumble upon the name in brittle county ledgers, half erased, dates crossed out, but the details always dissolve. An amateur historian once claimed to have traced a living descendant to a small town 2 counties over. But within months, his website vanished, his posts deleted. Friends said he stopped answering calls, muttering something about eyes in old photographs before disappearing from public view altogether. In Burn Hollow itself, nature has swallowed nearly every trace. The foundations of miners' cabins crumble under moss. Wildflowers bloom where coal dust once choked the soil. But the ridge is still avoided by hunters and hikers who've lived here all their lives. They say the birds go quiet when you approach. They say you feel as if someone is standing just behind you, even when you're alone. And sometimes, on the coldest mornings, you can see what looks like a lantern flicker between the trees before vanishing. A collector in Charleston owns the Elkins family Bible now. He keeps it locked in a fireproof case but admits he never sleeps well when it's in the house. He tried to sell it twice, yet both buyers withdrew after handling the photograph tucked inside. The collector told a local radio host that when he stared into Ruth's faded eyes, he felt as though she recognized him, as though she knew something about his own past he'd rather keep hidden. He laughed when he said it, but it wasn't a happy laugh. That's the thing about stories like this. They're not just about the past. They're about what we choose not to confront. Maybe the Elkins weren't unique. Maybe there are other ridges, other families, other hidden bloodlines that towns refuse to name. Perhaps every county has a quiet place where sins are buried beneath rotten timbers and wild roots, waiting for someone reckless enough to dig. The next time you pass an old farmhouse on a forgotten road, think about Ruth. Think about the photograph someone tried to hide. And ask yourself, if a stranger handed you proof of a century's worth of shame, proof your own family might share, would you look away, or would you look closer?